Friday the 13th is one of the most famous franchises in horror history. Even if you've never seen one, you probably already know Jason Voorhees, the music, and the general idea of a masked killer bringing his wrath down on unsuspecting teens in a summer camp setting. And if you're anything like me, and I know I am, then you've probably seen these movies enough times that they're comfort food at this point. Even with 12 movies to watch, so close, dang lawsuit, they're so familiar by now that you want something new to see, but that fills that Friday craving. Well, the good news is that the Friday franchise is so popular that there are many movies that are Friday in everything but name. Rip-offs, homages, pure coincidence, there are so many things that can really scratch that itch. And in the spirit of Summerween, and with the only Friday the 13th of 2025 almost here, I'm going to give you the top 13 Friday the 13th movies that aren't Friday the 13th. So what makes a movie a Friday the 13th movie and not just another slasher, which the Friday series helped to define, or a Halloween ripoff, which Friday started as and which there are hundreds of? Well, I think there's a few defining factors that every Friday the 13th-esque film needs to really be one. Being that the series is one of the defining slashers, its copycats mostly fall into that same category, but they can be played straight, for laughs, or somewhere in between. You absolutely need a central slasher killer for your story. Is it a masked, unstoppable monster? Is it a mystery that unravels until the end? It all depends on which Friday these movies are copying, but that means there's some nice variety in their approaches. Being set in nature is a huge part of the aesthetic of these films too, and being specifically set at a summer camp is even better. Throw in a tragic backstory or a legend that motivates the killer, and we're really getting lovely F-13 vibes. Not every movie will have all these elements, and some are more by coincidence while others are completely on purpose, but whatever the case may be, these are 13 Friday the 13th style movies for anyone looking for a new take on Crystal Lake. At 13, Madman from 1981, written and directed by Joe Giannone. Following the release of Friday the 13th in 1980, Sean S. Cunningham's original movie proved that it was possible to take the concept originated by John Carpenter's Halloween and replicate it for really cheap and make a massive profit. Afterward, we got the volcanic explosion of the slasher boom in the early 1980s, and one of the first was Madman. Itself set at the end of the summer camp season as the counselors spend one last night in the woods before heading home, only to awaken the legendary killer Madman Mars, who, of course, stalks them and picks them off one by one in the dark. He's big, bearded, kinda hillbilly-ish, badly dubbed with spooky noises, and mostly supernatural. And, well, I think Madman is actually pretty bad. Now, I'm a fan of plenty of cheesy movies, and I think so bad they're good films are a lot of fun when that balance is just right, but, like, Jesus, Madman is just so bad and boring. I'm sure people on the internet and in my comments will act very normal about that sentiment, but you really can't have a list of Friday the 13th style films without including Madman, which gives you everything those movies were offering, just without the talent or budget. So, what's the slasher style here? Pretty standard early slasher, played straight but very cheesy. Does it have a cool killer? Madman Mars is, memorable, I guess. How are those vibes? Dark and spooky with lots of nature. And finally, one of the best litmus tests for how good an unofficial Friday is a very simple question. Would I rather be watching an actual Friday the 13th movie than this? The answer for Madman and the next few entries is yes, I'd much rather be watching just about any Jason Voorhees story. At 12, In a Violent Nature from 2024, written and directed by Chris Nash. The newest entry on this list, I gotta tell you, I was so pumped for In a Violent Nature when it came out last year. This is essentially my perfect type of ASMR, just with Jason at the center. Well, I didn't really care all that much for the movie when I actually saw it, but I still think it's a really interesting experiment that would be a very simple Friday movie if told from a traditional standpoint. Here, it's a killer only known as Johnny, who rises from his woodland grave when a group of friends take his locket from his resting place. Now, Johnny hunts them down across a quiet naturescape. with long segments of the camera following the killer in his quiet, purposeful treks, interspersed with some absolutely gnarly set pieces. Side note, there's several kill scenes in here that are unforgettable, with one involving a hook and chain that is so unique and gory that it kinda outshines the rest of the movie. For the most part, all the exposition of Johnny's background and purpose happens off camera, in muffled snippets of dialogue from the people he hunts, which I think really plays off the idea of this all being a bit been there, done that. What I don't really care for is the film's sudden shift in perspective in its third act, deciding to follow seeming final girl Chris and leaving Johnny behind. It all gets a little too pretentious with long monologues on the nature of fear, killing, and survival, but I get that it's really trying to subvert our expectations. Still, it's an ambient experiment for Friday fans looking for an inverted take on the classic premise for the most part. What's the slasher style? Pretty serious, especially the ending, but the kills are so ludicrous you gotta laugh. Does it have a cool killer? Johnny is a lot like Part 3 Jason with a dash of Part 6. I think the antique firefighter mask makes him visually memorable. How are those vibes? Ambient and quiet. Me myself, I like long walks in nature, beautiful sunsets, and grotesque kills. And would I rather be watching an actual Friday the 13th film? Oh, most definitely. At 11, Hatchet from 2006, written and directed by Adam Green. The early 2000s were a really weird time for horror. On one side, you've got absolutely brutal films like Saw and Hostel, which most people refer to as torture porn. And on the other hand, you've got a lot of mainstream, big-budget horror stuff from big studios that essentially sand off all the sharp edges. And in between, the classic slasher was basically forgotten. That's where Adam Green's Hatchet movies come in, looking to be the throwback missing from theaters at the time and touting themselves as old-school American horror. And what that means is one of the most over-the-top slashers ever made. It all takes place in the Louisiana Bayou as a nighttime swamp tour is attacked by the legendary killer Victor Crowley, whose spirit is in constant search of vengeance for his wrongful death. Automatically, that's just a Jason movie. Our final girl is Mary Beth, played by Tamara Feldman, who's searching for her missing brother and father, and all that is basically set up for the blood and guts that follow. And when Victor Crowley attacks, his victims essentially explode into all manner of creative and practical viscera by special effects artist John Carl Buechler, who actually directed Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood. Low-key, one of my favorite Jason movies. This one is for the people that want crazy kill scenes prioritized and everything else a distant second. Hatchet has reverence for slashers of the past and makes that clear with cameos by Robert Englund and the late great Tony Todd, with Kane Hodder, the most famous Jason actor, as the massive and very angry Victor, a role he's now played as many times as he was Jason. I actually think the first Hatchet isn't all that good, but the sequels are stronger, with Hatchet 2 bringing in Danielle Harris as Mary Beth and getting its tonal balance and focus better. Green was clearly hoping for Victor Crowley to catch on as a new horror icon, which is a pretty tough goal for any modern film, but that just never happened. However, for anyone looking for insane kills with very gooshy practical effects that go hard, in a way the Friday films often couldn't due to heavy censorship, Hatchet has all you could ever want. What's the slasher style? This is a hyper-gory approach to a nature-set slasher, but it's so over the top that it's funny. Does it have a cool killer? Definitely. Victor Crowley isn't much more than a killing machine, but he's got a memorable look and a great performance by Hodder. How are those vibes? Kinda bad. It's a very bro-y movie. And would I rather be watching an actual Friday the 13th film? For all of Hatchet's intentions to be the new era of Jason, I'd still rather watch most any other Friday film. At 10, Fear Street Part 2, 1978 from 2021, written by Zach Olkovich and Lee Janiak and directed by Lee Janiak. Back in 2021, Netflix and Lee Janiak did a really cool event-style premiere of the Fear Street trilogy, which are adaptations of R.L. Stine's teen-focused series of horror novels, with each of these three debuting on the streaming platform 1 week apart, and it felt like a really big deal. The larger scope of the story is about teenager Dina trying to break the curse of witch Sarah Fier on the town of Shadyside. But with Part 2, we flash back to Camp Nightwing and a massacre that rocked the towns of Shadyside and Sunnyvale. And with camp slashers comes a lot of Friday inspiration. There's a good amount of camp drama counterbalanced by witch lore and slasher mayhem, but the focus here is really sisters Ziggy Berman, played by Sadie Sink, and her sister Cindy, played by Emily Rudd, who have a strained relationship that's tested when Cindy's boyfriend Tommy is possessed and goes on a killing spree. So yeah, it checks a lot of those early Friday boxes, and while it's set in the 70s instead of the 80s, it's pretty close in tone, style, and spirit to the first Friday film. I actually think it's shot really well, and has a good budget for its effects, leading to some good kills. Maybe a few too many "hey, it's the 70s" needle drops, but it really fits well with the Friday franchise. As the middle film of a tightly interconnected trilogy, 1978 is a little confusing if you watch it by itself, as it's essentially giving major backstory to everything that's happening in the larger story, but without its bookends, I think it's a really solid summer camp slasher. The only thing that's missing is having a memorable killer, as it's a possessed Tommy running around and attacking people without any real character, and only given a baghead mask at the very end. So there's not a great slasher icon to latch onto here. Beyond that, it's got good twists and turns with some great performances, especially Sadie Sink. What's the style? Total throwback, but sorta straddling classic slasher and modern drama. Does it have a cool killer? Not really. Tommy is just a possessed guy, and it's the film's big weakness. How are the vibes? Very summer-weeny. And would I rather be watching an actual Friday the 13th film? This is the point where I fully enjoy these movies for what they are, instead of wishing I was just watching a Friday the 13th movie instead. So no, I'm happy watching Fear Street for itself, and the same goes for all of the following films. At 9, Maniac Cop from 1988, written by Larry Cohen and directed by William Lustig. Maybe the entry on this list that's the furthest removed from the core Friday the 13th premise, Maniac Cop mashes together a New York cop crime procedural with a superhuman killer on the loose, and I actually think it works a lot better than you might expect. Maniac Cop sees a killer in a police uniform, the so-called Maniac Cop, terrorize New York City with a string of murders, with the film slowly revealing the killer to be former police officer Matt Cordell, played by Robert Z'Dar, who was framed for police brutality and seemingly killed by inmates in Sing Sing. But now he's back from the verge of death and really mad. Best of all, you've got two kings of horror with Bruce Campbell, everyone's favorite, and Tom Atkins, contractually obligated to at least elevate every movie into being entertaining, serving as co-leads of the film, with Campbell's Officer Jack Forrest suspected to be the Maniac Cop on the loose, and Atkins as Lieutenant Frank McRae, in charge of the investigation and uncovering what really happened to Cordell. Shot slightly differently, and this would be much more of a standard cop thriller, but Cohen and Lustig designed this film to be a horror movie, with Cordell as the hulking killer in the shadows, with a secret, tragic past that propels him to kill. Take off the police uniform and put on a hockey mask, and you've essentially got Jason Takes Manhattan, only with a lot more Manhattan and a lot less toxic waste. Oh, I can't be mad at you, Jason Takes Manhattan. You got Darkest Side of the Night. Future sequels would push the Matt Cordell character much closer to Jason, coming back as a Jason Lives-style undead monster as Maniac Cops 2 and 3, unsurprisingly, go crazy with their premise. What's the style? It's a mystery. In some ways that makes it more like the original Friday than the rest. Does it have a cool killer? For sure. I think Matt Cordell is intimidating, unpredictable, and haunting. And that's just from being a cop. Boom, got him. Hit my music. Okay, cut my music. How are the vibes? Pretty dark. I would say this is more in line with a gritty cop movie than most slashers. At 8, Freaky from 2020, written by Michael Kennedy and Christopher Landon, and directed by Christopher Landon. Pretty close to a straightforward comedy, Freaky is the result of a mashup between Friday the 13th and Disney's Freaky Friday, and when the movie was in production, it was actually titled Freaky Friday the 13th, but they probably had some trouble getting those rights cleared. All to say, it's a pretty easy layup for bringing together those two concepts in its film, but I think it executes it really well. Here, high school student Millie Kessler, played by Katherine Newton, is attacked by serial killer and urban legend the Blissfield Butcher, played by Vince Vaughn. But when he stabs her with a magical dagger, the two swap bodies, with Millie now trying to convince her friends of her identity and stop the Butcher from using his new body to rampage through the town. Freaky makes it very obvious that it's playing with the tropes of F-13, counting down from Wednesday the 11th with big bold letters on screen, and having Millie need to get her body back by midnight on Friday, or else be stuck as the Butcher forever. It's a really fun premise, and you basically already know exactly how it's going to play out, but I really like the characters, with Newton and Vaughn both being really good in their dual roles. There's a nice back and forth here between comedic character moments and really splattery kills that help the premise stay fresh throughout. And even though the Butcher starts as a masked, mute hulking beast like Jason, he eventually becomes his own unique killer in both bodies. It's very much in line with the recent wave of horror comedies that mash together a well-known concept with horror, like Totally Killer or Landon's Happy Death Day films. But it's a nice change of pace in the Friday-style canon. What's the style? Very much a comedy, but it doesn't sacrifice the slasher kills and atmosphere. Does it have a cool killer? As Vince Vaughn, the Blissfield Butcher is a pretty standard Jason replacement, but once Kathryn Newton is the killer, I think it's a really fun switch up. How are the vibes? I would say it's maybe 2 steps past gateway horror, with a high school dramedy making the scares easier. At 7, Psych's Tuesday the 17th from 2009, written by James Roday and Steve Franks, and directed by James Roday. Okay, hear me out here. This is a TV episode, but it's close to an hour, it's awesome, and it's Psych. Actually, Psych is one of my favorite TV shows, but I never get the chance to talk about it on the channel, so I really want to take this opportunity to talk about it just for a minute. You might be familiar with Psych, a comedy drama detective series centered on fake psychic Sean Spencer, played by James Roday, his best friend Gus, played by Dule Hill, and the Santa Barbara Police Department they help solve crimes. And with every episode, a new murder or crime pushes Sean and Gus into wild situations they need to think and joke their way out of. In Tuesday the 17th, the friends go back to Camp Tikihama, which they spent a summer at as kids and has been closed for years. Now, old acquaintance Jason, what a coincidence, is reopening the camp, but one of his counselors has gone missing and he needs their help to find out what happened. Well, it's no surprise that things seem to be very bad at the still closed campgrounds when they arrive, and the counselor's staff starts getting picked off one by one. But who is doing it and why? Tuesday the 17th is actually a fantastic take on Friday the 13th, and the show really works to bend its typical style to feel more in line with the films aesthetically, with nice scares that exist alongside Psych's awesome comedy. And not to spoil anything, but there are several twists that I would say are much better than the original Friday's Pamela reveal, which you still can't possibly guess if you watch that film. It's so good, it'll take you from saying, "Oh, Foggy's in this?" to saying, "Wow, this rules." Plus, it has something that no other film on this list can claim to have: Sean Spencer and Burton Guster.
But you can call me Slicks.
Slicks?
What's your name?
What's the slasher style? A condensed take on classic Friday, but with Sean and Gus in it. Does it have a cool killer? Yeah, I like it. A little more conventional than an undead guy in a hockey mask, but something that makes sense for Psych. How are those vibes? Chilly, spooky, and funny. At 6, The Final Girls from 2015, written by MA14 and Joshua John Miller and directed by Todd Strauss-Schulson. Slasher movies and heartfelt moments aren't exactly connected in the minds of most people, but if there's any movie that can do it, it's The Final Girls. While watching the slasher movie that starred her departed mom, Max and her friends are sucked into the story of Camp Bloodbath, which plays out over and over in a time loop that only our real-world heroes can see. Now, Max has the chance to reconnect with her mother through the character she once played, and hopefully change the rules of a well-loved genre as she tries to stop Billy Murphy, the masked machete-wielding urban legend killer compelled to take out anyone that has sex at the camp. So obviously, its summer camp setting and masked killer are most indebted to Friday the 13th, and while the film is poking at the obvious cliches and oblivious characters, it's having a lot of fun doing it. But The Final Girls is really about reconciling with a dead parent, as its co-writer Joshua John Miller drew from his own experiences with his father, Jason Miller, who starred in The Exorcist and passed away when his son was young. That's lived out through Max's experience with the character played by her mom, with Taissa Farmiga and Malin Ackerman bringing some unexpected emotional weight to the film. The Final Girls balances both sides of the horror-comedy equation and is really stylishly shot, with its characters trapped in and trying to bend the movie around them. Best of all, it has a big emotional undercurrent thanks to the relationship between Max and her mom, played out through the constraints of the slasher it fully embraces. That's the heart of the movie, using the slasher as a delivery system for reconciliation through art that's impossible in real life. I love that the slasher, with all its well-worn traditions, is almost like a comfort blanket for the heartache of both creator and character. What's the slasher style? Camp Bloodbath is played like every Friday the 13th cliche turned up to 11 for laughs, with the emotion coming from Max and her mom specifically. Does it have a cool killer? Billy Murphy is extremely close to Jason Voorhees, just a slightly different mask away from a lawsuit. But the pastiche is exactly what this movie wants. How are those vibes? Great cheesy summer camp stuff, but with a nice meta layer to it. At 5, The Town That Dreaded Sundown from 1976, written by Earl E. Smith and directed by Charles B. Pierce. The only Friday the 13th style film on this list to actually be made before Friday the 13th, The Town That Dreaded Sundown is incredibly influential and criminally overlooked. It's actually essentially a faux documentary, taking inspiration from real-life murders and crime spree, and using it to create something totally unique. I'm clearly a big fan of this movie. Last year I did a full dedicated video on it and its belated sequel remake from decades later, but I think Dreaded Sundown is important enough to the larger scope of the Friday films, and the slasher overall, that it should absolutely be included here. The Town That Dreaded Sundown is closely based on the real-life Texarkana Moonlight Murders, which saw 5 people murdered by a man called the Phantom Killer in 1946, who terrorized the Texas-Arkansas border for 3 months and then disappeared without a trace. Dreaded Sundown changes some of the details and invents some new people, but the larger details are the same as what actually happened. And with voiceover narrating the exact time, place, and details, the film feels much more realistic and less sensationalized than the slashers that followed. Sundown's most obvious influence is from the look of the Phantom being copied for Jason's Baghead appearance in Part 2, giving Mama Voorhees' baby boy a more human and wild look at first. And while Dreaded Sundown takes place in the hot Southwest versus Friday the 13th's Jersey forests, they both pull their scares from the urban legends hiding at the edge of town, where civilization gives way to nature and people indulge in their darkest impulses. It's a fascinating precursor to both true crime documentaries and slasher movies, blending them together for a quiet but unsettling experience that crosses over from the big screen and makes you fear the person next door. What's the style? Faux documentary, much more about the procedure and larger world than just the kills. Does it have a cool killer? At the risk of sounding uncaring to the real-world incidents, the Phantom Killer is an unforgettable slasher, just realistic enough to be disturbing. How are those vibes? Hot, sweaty, gritty, and just my type. At 4, The Slumber Party Massacre from 1982, written by Rita Mae Brown and directed by Amy Holden Jones. One of the big critiques that slasher movies often get is issues of sexism in these films, and with a lot of depictions of sex, violence, and nudity around women, I won't entirely dispute that, but I really do think that it's a few bad apples that make a bad name for these films in general. But I also think that's what makes these Slumber Party films so interesting. Starting with the original, which was heavily changed from feminist author Rita Mae Brown's screenplay Sleepless Nights and financed by Roger Corman, the Slumber Party films have all been shepherded by women writing, directing, and starring in every film. The thing is, these are still pretty traditional slasher movies, including high body counts, gory kills, and lots of drama. But the female perspective shifts everything just a little, with its characters, killer, and subtext having added layers you don't see much in the early slasher boom. Here, Trish Devereaux throws a slumber party while her parents are away, only for the party to be targeted by escaped serial killer Russ Thorne, who uses a massive drill for his kills. Soon the girls have to fight off a siege by the Madman and must band together when the adults and boys are offed. Of course, having this set in a suburb makes for a setting that's more like Halloween than Friday, but I see slumber parties as very similar to the Crystal Lake shenanigans. And our driller killer has the intensity of Jason, but Jones and Brown make the sexual subtext of his attacks very clear. The giant drill helps, of course, and the ways our girls find strength together makes this a standout. Best of all, it makes you like the characters and root for them, with their fight against a blatant psychosexual threat being really vicious and satisfying in the end. The Slumber Party and Sorority House films that followed all have women at the helm, and it's a really fascinating example of the differences that makes. What's the slasher style? Absolutely an early 80s slasher, with the drama and horror played straight. Does it have a cool killer? Russ Thorne is definitely one of the more disturbing slashers of the era. Not someone you could have fun rooting for, but that you really want ended. How are those vibes? Very fun, but also disturbing. This is a really great slasher all on its own. At 3, Sleepaway Camp from 1983, written and directed by Robert Hiltzik. Insane, problematic, disturbing, bad. There are many ways that people can describe a movie about a sleepaway camp rocked by a series of mysterious murders, but when I think about Sleepaway Camp, there's only one word that comes to mind: charming. But then again, I'm a dang-ass freak, so what do I know? The premise is so simple, you can probably already describe it just by the movie's title alone. Angela Baker, played by Felissa Rose, is a young girl spending the summer at Camp Arawak with her cousin Ricky. But this camp is no carefree getaway. Beyond the cook that should be convicted and the bullies, counselors and students are getting brutally dispatched one by one. Is a tragic and confusing death in the past involving Angela somehow connected? Well yeah, come on now. Cue insanely violent deaths, lots of odd camp drama, one hell of a mustache, and some of the best lines in horror history.
Eat shit and die, Ricky!
Eat shit and live, Bill.
And Sleepaway Camp's enjoyment comes less from the premise and much more from the execution. And even with the insanity and darkness of so much of this film, it's a good time. A huge portion of why I enjoy the Friday movies is vibe and familiarity. Maybe it's strange to say that a bunch of movies about people getting killed off by an unstoppable slasher are comfort films, but they are to me. And Sleepaway Camp is so clearly the result of a bunch of friends trying to make a fun movie and enjoying themselves along the way that it fits right in with that. If there's one thing that everyone talks about in Sleepaway Camp, it's the ending. And while I had it spoiled for me long before I ever saw it, I won't be spoiling it here. Safe to say, it's an ending that will shock and maybe offend you. I'd love to do a Sleepaway Camp retrospective on the entire series sometime soon, where I go into all that. So let me know if you're interested. What's the slasher style? It's everything you'd expect from a summer camp slasher, but insane. Does it have a cool killer? Yes. Without spoilers, the killer reveal is unforgettable. How are those vibes? It's unglamorous and unpleasant, but immaculate. At 2, The Burning from 1981, written by Bob Weinstein and Peter Lawrence, and directed by Tony Maylam. Not the first summer camp slasher on this list, but the one that I think does it the best. The Burning was actually written before Friday the 13th, but the success of that film helped this one get made. And the result is as straightforward of a slasher that you could possibly want, and is very one-to-one with the Jason Fridays. A summer camp, a scarred killer with a tragic connection to the area, camp counselors and students with all sorts of messy relationships, and some fantastic kills. The Burning is specifically pulling from the New York urban legend of Cropsey, which existed long before this film and who was also going to be featured in Madman before The Burning beat them to the punch, with a camp caretaker horribly disfigured in a prank gone wrong. Years later, he's released from the hospital and unleashes his rage on Stoneweather Summer Camp, with both counselors and students picked off one by one. Cropsey, Jason, Michael Myers, and so many other slashers are pulling from local legends of madmen, scary stories, and boogeymen. These are campfire tales. So what setting could possibly be better than camp? The Burning is deeply entrenched in summer camp life, maybe almost too much, as its first half details teen drama and summer flings more than the horror you're here for, but I dig it. This is Summerween after all. And for whatever reason, hot weather and beautiful nature just puts me in the mood for a horror movie. By playing with urban legends and literal campfire stories, The Burning uses its slasher events as both the fulfillment of, and basis for, scary stories that this ultimately embodies. What you absolutely need to see is the film's iconic raft attack, as Cropsey surprises a group on the water with his trademark garden shears, in an expertly edited sequence that relies more on the shock of the situation than Tom Savini's gore. For that alone, The Burning is a must-watch for slasher fans. And yes, the Weinsteins suck. So what's the slasher style? About as close to a platonic Friday the 13th as you could want. Does it have a cool killer? For sure. Cropsey is mostly hidden throughout the film, but he's a disturbed lunatic with a horrific face once revealed. How are those vibes? Very laid back and summery, with just a touch of scuzzy creepo. And at number 1, Just Before Dawn, written by Jeff Lieberman, Mark Arowitz, and Jonas Middleton, and directed by Jeff Lieberman. I've included Just Before Dawn on several lists before this, and I'm doing it again, because I really think this is an underseen gem of the entire slasher subgenre, and I'm gonna keep telling you to see it until enough people have. Just Before Dawn is a very simple, been there done that premise. A group of friends journey out into the wilderness only to be targeted by a backwoods killer, but its strength is in its execution, as its low budget is offset by its authentic wilderness location shooting, adding a realism of atmosphere that makes you feel the desperation and isolation of being in the middle of nowhere without it becoming exaggerated beyond belief. A rickety rope bridge or a fall into a river is dangerous enough, with the film's slasher using these vulnerabilities to keep victims at a disadvantage. Just Before Dawn really takes its time, with its first half establishing its deep woods setting and the dangers inherent in a very normal but unforgiving natural world. And while its central killer isn't amazing, the atmosphere, patient pacing, and especially the sound design make this so chilling at times. Specifically, that haunting whistle that opens and closes the film over a blood-red sunrise, and moments of disquieting, distant singing are really great, which adds tension despite a general lack of music beyond some stings here and there. As far as the actors, George Kennedy as a good-hearted park ranger and our final girl, Constance, played by Deborah Benson, who makes the most shocking and inventive choice I've ever seen in a final fight, really make this special. It's a film that fixates on the survival drive within each of us and what it takes to unlock it. And what you're left with in the end is a sense of inescapable inner darkness that really resonates. What's the slasher style? Perfect deep woods horror that outshines most other movies like it, including the Friday series. Does it have a cool killer? Without spoilers, because the killer's identity is hidden for the most part, it's a solid killer, but it's the larger story and threat that's really special. How are those vibes? Isolated nature with incredibly realistic atmosphere supported by Brad Fiedel's haunting ambient score. If you like the classic approach to slashers, this is about as good as it gets. And with that, we reach the end of this journey back to Camp Crystal Lake. Of course, no movie could ever truly replace the Friday the 13th films, and Jason still stands as one of my favorite characters in horror. But I find it so interesting to see just how influential these films are, even when radically changed for new approaches and meanings. There will only ever be one Jason Voorhees, but there's a whole world of Friday the 13th films left for you to discover. Thanks for watching today's video, and welcome back to Summerween. And as I was planning this month of videos, I thought it would be really fun to go back to Friday the 13th. But then I realized that I've kind of covered everything that there is to talk about the franchise. You may know that I've done an entire retrospective on the franchise in the past, and I also did a video on all of the unmade sequels to those movies. So what to do with another Friday the 13th video? And that's when I realized that there are many Friday the 13th ripoffs, both on purpose and by accident. And it's a little bit more complicated than just calling them ripoffs, but they are Friday the 13th style movies. So why not do 13 of them? It's a lot of fun going back to this style of film because I generally just really love these movies. Not all of them are great, but a lot of them are entertaining. And I hope that this video gave you a few ideas for what to do for your own Summerween. Movies to watch, that is, not events in your own personal life. Of course, nothing will ever quite beat an actual, official Friday the 13th movie, especially the best 4 or 5. But sometimes you gotta do something just a little bit different to scratch that itch. And like I said in this video, there's only a few of these movies on this list that made me wish that I was watching an actual Friday the 13th movie. And some of the ones at the top are some of the best slashers ever in general, I think. And there will be more slasher videos coming later this year, especially around the Halloween season, as I'm working on something really big and really special. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these films and your own personal Friday the 13th style film that isn't actually part of that series. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons and members for their continued support. And if you'd like to be a member or patron, it's only $2 a month for early access to every video and a monthly exclusive review, with the review for June and Summerween being Shaun of the Dead. I'm also just about to cross 200 total patrons and members, and the goal for that is to make a Chucky retrospective. So if you want that to happen, join in. And until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and having a happy Summerween.